Okay, welcome to Freedom of Information, Nuts and Bolts. I'm Michael Higgins, supervising attorney with the University of Buffalo School of Law, Civil Rights and Transparency Clinic. We're a pro bono law firm composed of UB Law faculty members and student attorneys working for government transparency. To support that work, we provide trainings like this and also litigation support for investigative journalism and community activism. Today, student attorneys Keith Jensen and Colton Kells will explain the basics of freedom of information law. And if you have questions as you go, please type them in the chat to indicate that you have a question, or you can type the whole question, and we'll do our best to answer all your questions today during the webinar. But if there are questions we can't get to, we'll distribute a tip sheet to attendees. Also, today's presentation is recorded, so we'll post that in the next few days. So now I'll turn it over to student attorneys Keith Jensen and Colton Kells.
Thank you, Mike, and thank you everyone for joining us this morning. My name is Keith Jensen, and I'm a student attorney with the University of Buffalo's Civil Rights and Transparency Clinic. And I'm going to start with going over our agenda for today. I'll give a general overview of freedom of information laws, also provide a scope. So what do freedom of information laws cover and what do they not cover? We're going to go over some exemptions and fees, and then I'll turn it over to Colton, and he will take you through the writing process and how to access documents. And he'll also give you a few examples of writing requests and give you some tips. And then we'll provide additional resources and go a little bit more in depth as to how we can help in the future. Okay, so how to access documents. There are two ways to go about accessing documents from the executive government. So there's the federal, which is the Freedom of Information Act, and there's New York State, which is the Freedom of Information Law. The Freedom of Information Act is a federal freedom of information law, and it requires full or partial disclosure of previously unreleased information and documents controlled by the US government upon request. The Act defines agency records subject to disclosure, outlines mandatory disclosure procedures, and defines 9 exemptions to the statute. The general purpose behind the Act and freedom of information laws generally, they're intended to make government agency functions more transparent so that the public could more easily identify problems and address those problems. Be able to put pressure on government actors and having the information that citizens need to be in the know. And a FOIL request refers to a formal submission requesting information from New York State rather than from the federal government on the basis of New York's Freedom of Information Law. Next, we will be going over the scope of FOIL. So FOIA and FOIL both provide access to agency records. So we need to look into what is considered an agency and what is considered a record. This definition here specifically is for FOIL, so New York State's Freedom of Information Law, but it can be, it's also easily applied to FOIA. You would just want to look specifically at FOIA's definition. So in terms of agency, any state or municipal department, board, except for the judiciary or the state legislature. So within the meaning of FOIL, agency also includes local legislatures, and it also includes city councils. What we want to be aware of when we think of agency is that there's what's considered a quasi-governmental agency. And that means that there's entities that work and they are performing government functions. So these entities are subject to FOIL. And it can be up for debate. It is a contentious issue whether or not some entities are indeed subject to FOIL. If you make any requests and it's up in the air and there's question of whether or not an entity is indeed subject to FOIL, You can look online. Most entities will provide online whether or not they are subject to FOIL. And you can also look to the Committee for Open Access to Government. It is a New York State committee that is meant to deal with FOIL and make decisions on who is and isn't subject to FOIL. Now, in terms of record, we want to be as broad as possible when thinking about what could or couldn't be considered a record. So it means any information kept, held, filed, produced, reproduced by an agency or state legislature. So it can take many different forms. It can be papers, photos, letters, computer tapes, regulations, codes. If there's a question of whether or not something is considered a record, be creative. Don't hold back. Okay, next we're going to go over some of the exemptions. These are specific to FOIA, the Freedom of Information Act, so the federal. Some of them are pretty straightforward. So classified national security secrets, you will come across those quite often in if you're working for the media. Internal personnel rules, you'll also come across that quite often. Other statutory exemptions, trade secrets and business confidentiality, intra-agency documents. So this refers to when government officials are giving advice between each other. We want to make sure that government officials can give candid advice. So this sort of protects certain communications between government officials, but not all. So it's something that you would want to look into deeper if it came up. And personal privacy, law enforcement, another popular one, financial regulator reports, and now we can move on to the FOIL exemptions. Okay, so similar to the FOIA exemptions, records exempted by state or federal statute, personal privacy, trade secrets, evidentiary privileges, law enforcement records, life and safety, again, interagency and intra-agency records, and information assets security. Okay, so both FOIA and FOIL are not free. There can be some hefty fees and they can add up. Under FOIA, agencies charge for search, review, and duplication. There are fee limitations for news media requesters and if you're requesting for educational or scientific purposes. And there's also a public interest fee waiver that's explicitly offered through FOIA. So if you think that you may fall under one of these categories, definitely make sure that you reach out and state that you either think that you are eligible for a fee limitation or a fee waiver. Under FOIL, there is no explicit public interest fee waiver or fee limitations provided, but you can still ask and it still can be awarded. Under FOIL, agencies can only charge up to 25 cents per page for duplication. So when you're making your requests, you want to make sure that it's specific as possible to the information that you're looking for. This makes sure that you can keep the fees to a minimum, especially when you're asking for records that may be producing hundreds of thousands of documents and pages. So from here, I'm gonna turn it over to Colton, and he's going to go over the process for making sure that you write the most succinct request and keep the fees as low as possible.
Thank you very much, Keith. And like Keith said, I'm going to give a brief overview of the typical Freedom of Information processes. First, we'll look at FOIA on this slide, and then next we'll take a look at FOIL. This FOIA track that we're looking at is a simplified track. There's also a complex track that your request may be put into if your request is a little more complex than the average one. However, for today, we're just going to look at the simple track, and you start by making your request to the agency. This will trigger all of the next steps. So after you have made your request to the agency then has 20 days to issue its response. The agency can either grant your request, deny it, or issue a partial denial to parts of your request. If your request is granted, congratulations, you're pretty much done. You'll just have to get your documents, which can take a little work, and then you might have to fight over fees, as well as Keith indicated earlier. However, if you receive a denial or a partial denial, you then have 90 days to appeal that decision to the agency. The agency will then have to take a second look at your request, and within 20 days issue a second decision on the appeal. Here they can either grant your request, deny it, or have a partial denial. It's at this point that you can file your FOIA request in federal court. You have 6 years to file your FOIA request after receiving a denial on your appeal. So keep that in mind. It's a rather long length of time to file the lawsuit, and you'll see in the next slide that the FOIA timelines are a little bit shorter. So here we have the FOIL timeline. It's very similar, however, it has a couple extra complexities to it, and also the timelines, as you'll notice, are much, much shorter than the FOIA timelines. First, you start off the same way by making your request. Within 5 days, which is a rather short time, the agency can either acknowledge your request and promise to respond within a reasonable time. Whatever that reasonable time is will depend on the facts of your request, the circumstances of the agency, but the agency can also respond within these 5 days with either a denial or a grant. If your request is granted, you should receive your documents within 20 days or a reasonable time. If you're denied, however, or issued a partial denial, then you have 30 days to appeal that decision to the agency. The agency then has 10 days to issue a second decision on your request. If it's granted, congratulations, you should receive your documents soon. However, if it's denied, then this is when you can file your Article 78 petition in New York Supreme Court. I would just like to highlight that you have to do this within 4 months. This is extremely short, and especially short considering the FOIA timeline allows you 6 years. Okay, so getting to the content of your requests. The first thing you want to do is define your goal, define your project, set out and think about what information you want, what kind of questions you're looking to answer. And then after you have these questions, it's time to do a lot of research. It's easier to handle the request if you do a lot of this research on the front end, because then you can be as specific as possible and as well informed as possible when you start communicating with the agency you're requesting records from. So while you're doing your research, you might want to look to see if you can get this information from other public sources. It's entirely possible that the information you're looking for has already been requested and published by another. Additionally, you want to learn as much about the agency, especially its organizational structure, and as well as how they keep documents, what types of documents they keep, what these records are called. All of that information is extremely important to specify in your request. If you're able to identify a certain record and you know where it's kept, that makes it a lot easier for the Freedom of Information Officer to get that record for you and produce it quickly. Okay, we're going to go through a quick checklist to go through the rest of the substance that should be included in your request. First, make sure you address it to the right agency's Freedom of Information Officer. Every agency has a specific Freedom of Information Officer that is in charge of responding to requests. This officer will be your main source of contact, usually throughout the administrative level, and will be responsible for helping you resolve your request. It's important to remember that these Freedom of Information Officers are people, and generally they will work with you. This can be a conversation. This person is a public servant. They may have certain personal inclinations towards your request. However, it is their job to either, to fulfill your request to the extent of the law. Second, you'll need to invoke the proper law. Just as a quick brief reminder, FOIA for federal documents, FOIL for state documents. Next, and this is optional, but you can provide background information on the issue that you're researching if you'd like. If a record is covered by freedom of information law, you're entitled to it no matter what your reason is. But there are a few different reasons that you might want to include this background information about either your organization or about the reasons why you want this information. First of all, if your request is fairly complex, this kind of background information can give the Freedom of Information Officer a better idea of the types of documents that might be responsive to your request or might help you to answer the types of questions you're looking to answer. On the other hand, it's also important to remember that if you reach the litigation stage, the judge will be reading this request, and this will be a good way to set up the background to the issue that you want that might be more compelling to a judge or the general public. Next, you need to describe the records you're requesting. This is the most important part of your request, and this is what the agency will use to determine whether or not a record is responsive to your request. Like we said before, make sure you're as specific as possible when describing these records. If you know the name of the record, state it. If there's a date that you want a certain record from, dates are extremely helpful. Make sure you describe the records with as much specificity as possible. Next, and this is also optional, you can ask the agency to waive its fees, as Keith went through earlier, and you can also ask for expedited service. It's always a good idea to ask for expedited service, especially if the information that you're requesting is time sensitive. Requesting expedited service will move your request to the top of the Freedom of Information Officer's pile. This can be extremely helpful for agencies that have a very long FOIL or FOIA backlog. Next, also, it's important to specify the format that you want the records produced in. Generally, it's smart to ask for records in electronic format. This will eliminate or reduce the fees that you may be charged and is likely the fastest way to get your records. However, please keep in mind that if you need the records in a specific format for another reason, then you make sure that you make that clear in your request. You also need to make sure that you are reminding the agency of its legal obligations and deadlines. FOIL and FOIA offices are generally pretty overloaded. It is important that you keep the pressure on the agency to meet all of its deadlines. This is also a helpful way to document the timeline of your request for the court if your request reaches litigation. And then last but not least, it's always important to provide the best contact information that the agency can contact you at. Especially in these times when you may not be at your normal office number, it's important that these officers can get into quick contact with you to help fulfill your request. It's not at all uncommon for a Freedom of Information Officer to reach out to you to help clarify certain portions of your request that might be possibly ambiguous. And they can also provide you with information that you might not have known. They will know the structure of the agency better. They'll know what types of records the agency keeps the best. And talking to this person is a good way to get that information if you're unable to find it elsewhere. They also might ask you to limit your request in some way. Sometimes they'll do this in order to find a way to resolve your request faster. And they also might try to negotiate a production schedule, especially if your request is extremely voluminous. If you're asking for hundreds of thousands of pages of documents, you might come to an agreement where the agency is producing a certain amount of documents per month or per week, or however you guys might decide. Okay, and so now we're going to look at two actual FOIL requests to show you what these look like. The first one that we're going to look at that you can see now is rather simple and informal, and the other one is a little more formal and more complex. However, both of these requests were valid and would trigger the agency's burden to respond to you. This first request was written as an email, but it still invokes FOIL. It lists 3 categories of records that the requester is seeking. It acknowledges the fees. It asks for a public fee waiver, and it asks for the records in electronic format. While this request isn't perfect and rather simple and informal, this would be a valid request and an agency would have to respond to it. In these next 4 slides, we're going to look at 4 portions of a more complex request that was filed to the Buffalo Police Department seeking its body-worn camera policy. As you can see, this request is directed to the Freedom of Information Officer at Buffalo Police Department, Captain Jeffrey Rinaldo. It's important to note that the Freedom of Information Officer, that might be their entire job, or it might just be a small part of their job. For example, Captain Rinaldo has many jobs at the Buffalo Police Department, and this is just one part of his job. As you can see, the requester also makes it very clear under which law he's requesting records. In both the subject line and the first sentence of this request, he generally and more specifically references the Freedom of Information Law or Public Officers Law, Section 84. On the second page, the requester describes the records requested. As I mentioned, he was requesting BPD's body-worn camera policy. In order to provide some background, the requester references a news article that describes the draft policy, and this would likely help a Freedom of Information officer locate those records requested. This is one way to provide background information, but another way would be to include specific search terms. This requester was looking for one specific document. However, you can imagine if you were looking for documents of a certain category or that all concern a certain subject, you might want to include search terms. Okay, in this section, the requester gets a little bit more specific on certain details in order to sharpen his request. This is useful for a few reasons. Specifically, this amount of detail will help the Freedom of Information Officer locate your records that might be responsive to your request more quickly. And this will also help to prevent the agency from claiming that your request is too broad or not well described. Here, the requester included a time period. This time period is rather short, but it extends to the date that the request is actually filled. This is important because this will ensure that the requester receives the most up-to-date information. Next, the requester asks, and I'll be generally, which records he would like searched. You can be more specific in this section if you know how the records are kept, or if you know the organizational structure of the agency's offices, or if you know a specific person who might actually have the records you're requesting. But this is a little more general, but still important to include. And the requester next has also requested any metadata contained in the records requested. This metadata itself can provide useful information like how many drafts of a document might have been created, the date the document might have been created, which people might have worked on the document. All of this information can tell a story in and of itself. When requesting documents, it's often a good idea to get this metadata as well. And then the requester next also specifies the form of production. Here, he asks for the records in electronic format in order to avoid fees. And then lastly, here the requester reminds the agency of its obligations. Specifically, the requester included the timeline for the government's response. The requester goes further and also describes the agency's obligations to redact documents where appropriate and asks the agency to justify all withholdings and redactions of records. This is important because although the agency is required by the law to do these things, specifically putting it into your request will log that and track that for the court if your request is to reach litigation. And then last but not least, don't forget to provide your best contact information. Thank you very much. And although both the requests we looked at have their differences, both would be valid and require an agency to respond. Now I'll turn it back over to Mike.
Thanks, Colton. Thanks, Keith. So I just want to talk a little bit about some different resources that you can access that might help you if you encounter problems. So first, for information about guidance and the law, you can contact us. We're happy to talk to journalists about crafting their FOIA and FOIA requests, handling appeals, And we also accept cases for litigation. So we might represent you in a lawsuit against an agency. We have limited resources to do that, but we do like to hear about those requests so that we can consider them. You can do that by emailing us at the contact information on this screen. You can also contact the New York State Committee on Open Government. Keith told you about this agency. They will write advisory opinions about whether or not an agency is doing the right thing. They can also help you direct your request to the right agency if you're not sure who has the information. Also on their website, they have voluminous resources considering past FOIL requests, giving you information about different agencies or different granular issues about FOIL. At the federal level, there's the Federal Ombudsman Program, which is in the Office of Government Information Services and the National Archive. These are people who are designed to help you negotiate with your FOIA requests with federal agencies. And then there's also a great website for FOIA, which is called foia.wiki. That's a collaboration of many groups, including the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press. And it has just really great information about almost any FOIA issue you could encounter. So that's a place to go if you have questions about something an agency is telling you or crafting your requests. There's also places you can go to get more information about public records, both to find public records and to find out more about the agencies. So one is Muckrock. Muckrock will automate your FOIA and FOIL requests for you. And then there's also a database of already completed or requested FOIA and FOIL requests. So you can search their database for things that people have already tried to get from agencies. You can also, New York State has a web portal to make your FOIL requests called Open FOIL. And then there's also links there to agencies' proactive disclosures. So agencies are required to publish certain information that's already been requested through FOIL, and you might find some of it there. The same is true of FOIA. FOIA.gov has an online portal to submit your requests. And then individual agencies have reading rooms, which is another place where they proactively disclose their information that's already been requested. So those can help you understand a little bit more about what's been requested, how records are kept, what's being denied. Okay, and then I just also wanted to reiterate a couple of the tips and tricks that Colton and Keith gave you. So first, do your homework. You can search what way agencies keep their records. In federal agencies, they actually publish something called their System of Records, which is an explanation of how they keep their records. New York State does something similar, but the agencies do a much worse job of that, and you have to do more digging on their websites to try and figure that out. You can also pick up the phone, right? You can develop sources within these agencies that might describe to you how these records are kept. You can call the records access officer and ask how the records might be kept or what requests might be fulfilled and how you can draft your requests to help them do their job. And then Colton also told you that records access officers are people too. So sometimes maybe often they're suspicious of your motivations in requesting the records. So you don't have to give them a reason, but you can give them a reason because sometimes they're persuadable. FOIA and FOIL are discretionary laws, right? They don't mandate that the government keep any information from you. In fact, all the exclusions are discretionary. So even if a record falls within a exclusion, meaning they're not legally obligated to give it to you, they can still give it to you. So you might want to explain to them why it would be important or beneficial for the agency to release the document to you. And then also, like, all the homework that you do can make their job easier. It can make them find these records more quickly. Know your rights and assert your rights. So part of that is putting it in the request. citing to the law, citing to their timelines. You should also track your timelines. I suggest that you have a spreadsheet of your FOIA and FOIA requests with their timelines so that you can keep on top of the agency. When in doubt, appeal. If they deny you the record, it makes sense to appeal, usually. I will say that on occasion, it makes sense to negotiate with the records access officer before you appeal. The appeal timelines are pretty fast and strict, and so it might be the case that threatening an appeal might get you further, and then also sort of discussing what the holdup is might be a good idea. So I know that for some of you, this information was a little basic, and you might be more advanced users of FOIA, and we're happy to answer questions that you might have generally or more specifically in the time that we have remaining. So you can either include yourself, you can chat a question, or unmute yourself and just ask a question.
I have a question. This is Heather Abraham. I'm at Georgetown Law School at the Civil Rights Clinic, and I had a question based on something that Keith said. I don't know, Keith, if you have the ability to bring up your slides from before, but there was something among the exemptions. I think it was the last one, the last bullet point. I'm not familiar with that, and I don't know if anyone, Keith or anyone on the program, can tell me what that means. So information asset security, when would someone have that sort of exemption?
That's a very uncommon exemption. It's yeah, it's not one that I've actually litigated or encountered. So you had something, Ms. Lindsay?
Yes, Rachel Lindsay from the Buffalo News. When we ask to access documents, can we request to view the documents in person, or is it best that we ask for hard copies of those or PDF files?
You can absolutely ask to inspect in person. You have that right. It's explicitly given to you in FOIA and FOIL, and that's a good strategy for reducing your fees because they can't charge you for you looking in the records. Different agencies are have different policies about that. So sometimes it's an easy thing to do, and sometimes it's a hard thing to do. So I've done it before at like the New York City Housing Authority, and that took many phone calls and lots of negotiation to get in the room. But it can be a good way to keep your fees down, and then you can scan the documents with your own device, using the scanning function on your phone or something like that.
Also, do you have a template for how we can file an appeal?
We haven't created one, and the reason for that is that I think that they are sort of fact specific. So, if just saying that you appeal is enough, I would say that you want to identify the correct person to appeal to, because those requests can get lost for sure. So yeah, I think the reason that they denied you matters, but you'll see success in appeals just by virtue of saying, like, I appeal, and not really specifying the reason. But to the extent that you can specify a reason, I think that's helpful. And we're happy to discuss like specific denials to try and help you craft an appeal.
All right, thank you.
Someone asked whether the slides will be available. We'll make the slides and this presentation available on our website, and I'll email it to anyone who attended today.
I think we had a question typed in from Alan. He says, great info. Do you have any examples of metadata? So metadata, it provides sort of a larger of everything that's happening within the agency's systems that they're working in. So it gives you how many communications are going back and forth, the large data, not specifics within those communications, but it will let you know like the larger trends that are occurring within their system. And so you can see, for example, when documents are last edited, you can see when they were last viewed. And those types of things can be really helpful in certain situations.
Some other examples of metadata are, so for a photograph, for example, it might tell you the device that it was used, the date it was created on, or the name of the author. For larger databases, you might get edit records, right? So when a document was changed, by whom it was changed, um, things of that nature. One way to get metadata is to do what we were suggested, which is to specifically request metadata and explain, what metadata you expect to receive. But another way to get it is to ask for electronic documents in their native format, which basically means that they're not altering the document before you give it to you, and then you can search for the metadata yourself.
Can I follow up on this? Is Heather Abraham again. Can you give an example of a time that metadata has been something that, for example, a reporter has wanted to use to try to argue something in a story or present something in a story?
Yeah, I can maybe anonymize a request I've gotten before, which is to so someone was interested in basically pictures that the government agency said were not subject to disclosure. But the reporter didn't really want to know actually what was in the photos. He didn't want to see them. He basically wanted to know how many photos there were and when they were created. And so metadata could give you that information. Courts are a little, they're not super hip on metadata, right? So it can be hard to explain to them exactly what you want, why you're entitled to it. And then there's also sort of conflicting rules in different places about what metadata you're entitled to. In some instances, you're only entitled to the metadata if you're entitled to the original document. Whereas in other cases, you might be entitled to the metadata independent of the underlying document that you want. All right. Well, if there's no more questions about FOIA and FOIL, we're really happy that you came to our presentation today, and just want you to know that we're here as a resource to help, especially investigative reporters here in Western New York. So please contact us if you have questions about particular requests, and good hunting, I guess. Thanks, everybody.
Take care, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.